What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the shop. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast. My name is Eitan Mozia. You can find me on Twitter at Eitan Mozia. And it is a game of inches out there in more ways than one. So welcome to today, the day after Joe Mixon and the Cincinnati Bengals played the Cleveland Browns and showed us all that Joe Mixon and the Cincinnati Bengals have no idea how good they could be for each other. That coaching staff has no idea that, yeah, you might be running the same type of offense as the Los Angeles Rams. You might be trying to do the same types of things, but those motions that they do, that trickery that they do, the ability to get a guy like Joe Mixon in space and not having to deal with the frailties of an offensive line are what makes him good. Saquon Barkley can say the same. And these guys do not deserve that. So today, we are the Saquon Barkley. We are the Joe Mixon support group, and we are presented by Manscaped.com. Just like those guys, just like Joe Mixon, just like Saquon, it's not their fault for having incompetent front offices and coaching staffs. It's not their fault that they're not able to get really any yards before contact in their respective offenses. Nor are they the reason why their blockers are overmatched and can't give them the iota of space they need to look and feel their best. Just like it's not their fault, it's not yours either for having some hairs out of place or being sacked in the red zone due to BO interference. So do what you can. Save face. Go to www.manscaped.com. Check out the perfect package, lawnmower, or maybe just some deodorant to keep your footballs game ready. Just use our exclusive code DynastyD at checkout for 20% off. Again, that's code DynastyD. And this week, I am extremely excited to have a man join me in the shop who I believe qualifies as the undisputed number one fantasy football theorist, football thinker, and overall NFL historian this space has ever seen. Everyone will go ahead and tell you the same thing about this man. I will. Everyone on Football Guys staff will. Scott Barrett and everyone at Fantasy Points will. And by mentioning all these people, I hope you kind of get the connection here. The man that I am happy to go ahead and pull the mask off today is a Mr. Adam Harstad. What's going on, man?
Not too much. Just hoping I can live up to that intro there.
Hey, man, I don't think the intro did it justice. I think we still need to keep going with that. Like, again, you are one of the people that is at the very pinnacle, at the very top of the pantheon of analysts that I respect, not only because of their knowledge of both sides of the game and their knowledge of the analytical side of the game, but also just the theory side of the game and the game theory aspect of this whole dynasty game we play. So I wanted to get into that today. It was going to be less about players, more about maybe the why of it all. And I couldn't think of a better person to join me to do so.
Well, thanks for having me on.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get right into it. But before we even do, if you're not following him on Twitter, please do yourself a favor. He's a green elephant. Go ahead and follow him. His name is Adam Harstad, and that is also his Twitter handle. Just type that in, and you will find exactly who I'm talking about. But Adam, going back to you, one of the reasons that I find your analysis so unique is because it's holistic. You tend to tie in player value, important data points, game theory, basic psychology, all together when making fantasy decisions in a way that I think is unmatched in the fantasy community. I wanted to ask you, what led you here? What caused you to become such a deep thinker in the fantasy space? And does that carry over to every aspect of life? How did that work? Is it osmosis?
So the playwright, George Bernard Shaw, he has this famous quote, supposedly, and he says that few people think more than 2 or 3 times a year. I have made an international reputation for myself by thinking once or twice a week. And it's kind of one of those things where, okay, it's just George Bernard Shaw being super pompous, but counterintuitively enough, our brains are kind of designed to think as little as possible because thinking is very costly in terms of resources. And so actually the brain is designed to search for shortcuts wherever it can. It's got a lot of heuristics, a lot of rules of thumb. We find, for instance, people that we trust, and we're happy to outsource a lot of our thinking to them. Scouting football players is very hard, but I think somebody like Matt Waldman does an excellent job at it. And so instead of devoting the time and the resources and the energy to do all that thinking, it's much, much easier for me to just, follow Matt Waldman and listen to what he says and let him do that thinking for me. And I think that's the real secret to my success. Is you'll hear a lot of fantasy people talk about how their work ethic was crucial to get them where they were. But for me, it's really that I am extraordinarily lazy. And so and people think I'm being glib, but like really, I just search for whatever shortcuts I can find. And it's worked out pretty well for me so far, both because it's gotten me where I am, and I'm extremely grateful to be where I am. But also because it does save me a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And that's a win in my book too.
It's all about pushing towards the path of least resistance when it comes to information gathering for me as well. I follow the people I know that are going to make it easier for me to know the Devy prospects that are coming out in 2023, because I cannot tell you, don't care enough to go ahead and look deeply enough into those guys. But I do care enough to at least sound somewhat educated when I'm having conversations about these guys. So it pays to find things and find people who are experts in the field that you want to become maybe a little bit wiser in, and do your best to go ahead, follow them, listen to what they do, support their work, and just kind of keep it moving that way. So yeah, I definitely do get that. Now, like, is that like a compartmentalization of thought sometimes when it comes to looking at fantasy? Do you have to maybe take some of the real world thought processes out of it, or the real world like wants out of it when it comes to try to do that information gathering process? Because one of the problems that I've found with this space as a whole is kind of as we've advanced as a community, I would say probably especially in the past 3, 4, 5 years or so, people have gotten so much smarter. And there's so much more information that's readily available out there for people to consume that it gets to a point where it's almost information overload. It's drinking from a fire hose, and it's making people kind of unable to analyze and figure out, okay, well, I have, variable X, Y, Z, and so on. But how much does each of these variables matter? And how much should I really be looking at each of these variables other than just assuming that they're important because it's data that we can collect? How do you kind of drill down to what the pillars of your fantasy football thought process are going to be when trying to examine a certain situation?
Well, for me, the guiding principle is that, in Dynasty, it's that other people are smart. And I always want to start from a position that other people know what they're doing. And I think, it seems very basic when you say it, but I think a lot of analysis doesn't really start from that position. There's this idea that, I've found this great secret that's going to unlock everything. And I remember, I think around 2014, 2015, there was a big debate about wide receivers. And there were people who were saying that size was the key at wide receiver. Big receivers were more likely to get 1,000-yard seasons. Big receivers were more likely to get 10 touchdown seasons. The majority of top-notch dynasty receivers were big receivers. And players like Odell Beckham and Antonio Brown were discounted as a result. And players like, Mike Evans and Des Bryant to some extent were raised in exchange. And my problem with that was this assumes that NFL decision makers are dumb. And basically that after, we just had the 100th season of the NFL, after 100 seasons of evaluating football players, they didn't realize, they never made the connection that, oh, hey, maybe it's good for wide receivers to be big. We should look into that sometime. And so that's a heavy lift. It's possible. baseball was around for however long, and they didn't realize quite how important batting average was. So it's possible for people to overlook these major things, but it's going to require a lot of evidence to convince me that that's what happened. And indeed, when you looked at it, what happened was bigger receivers were in fact more productive, but they were also going higher in the draft. So NFL types knew that being big was good and was important, and they were drafting bigger players higher. If you look at the 10 highest drafted receivers were about a half inch taller than the next 10 highest drafted receivers, who were about a half inch taller than the next 10 highest drafted receivers, and so on and so forth. So it's not a surprise that big receivers were the most productive, because the highest drafted receivers were the most productive.
They also got the most opportunity early because of that draft capital.
Yeah, absolutely. But then you get a guy like Odell Beckham, who's drafted high. I think he was 12th overall, despite not being big. He's 5'10", 5'11", and basically what the NFL is saying is, we know being big is good. We know that. We get that. But we like this guy so much that we're going to draft him this high, despite the fact that he's not big. And, obviously the career's had some ups and downs, but I think it's been a pretty clear vindication of NFL scouts that, yeah, Odell Beckham deserved to go that high, despite not being 6'4" like Mike Evans. And I've seen studies where people have found that, yes, there's a correlation between height and production, but if you control for draft position, that correlation completely disappears. There's a relationship, but it's already completely accounted for by the NFL. And I think a lot of new analysis, it's like that. You find something and it's promising, and you run the tests and you say, yes, I can demonstrate that this matters at an NFL level. And then the test is always, okay, now control for draft position. And does that relationship hold, or does that relationship vanish? And for the most part, pretty much any relationship, once you control for draft position, tends to vanish. And the reason why is because NFL general managers are smart. And whatever you found that's important, they've also found that's important. And they're going to draft players who are good at that high. And in the instances where they draft a guy high and he wasn't good at that, usually there's a pretty good reason, like maybe he's Odell Beckham.
Yeah, I definitely get that. And I think that's kind of the issue with some of the analysis out there, that the confounding variables are never really kind of outed. People don't really think about the other factors that could be involved in, yes, maybe you see a correlation between your certain data point and your statistic and whatever's happening, but there's so many things happening at once on a football field. 1/11 of the entire team's play on this particular instance is only controlled by this player. And even that 1/11 that's controlled by that player, that may be entirely in the hands of another player. For example, like as in a wide receiver or in a running back, pretty much the entire team controls so much more than he does when it comes to what he's actually able to display on a football field. So it's so difficult to kind of drill down to the one or two things to really look at. That, yeah, I do think it pays to kind of come at this from a perspective of, okay, just for experiential purposes, these people have been doing it for a long time. If anything, they've probably been doing it longer than me. So by that just line of thinking in and of itself, it probably means that maybe I should defer to these guys more often than not. That said, I mean, there are some laughably bad front offices out there as well. There are also some laughingly bad coaches out there as well, who I think we can really kind of have a true and honest conversation about, why are these guys still employed when it's possible to go ahead and maybe employ somebody who might come in with a different line of thought. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they're infallible. I would just say that we should, at least from a starting point, assume that, okay, let's assume what I'm looking at is true. Let's try to work from there. And if we need to work backwards, then we can at least kind of go on it that way, rather than, oh, I found this really cool thing. Let's make this the forefront of all analysis moving forward.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's key to differentiate between, coaches as a profession and coaches as individuals, because yes, you're absolutely right. There are some very bad coaches. There's some very bad front offices. But the crucial thing about the NFL is that, I mean, if I am wrong about something, if I'm very publicly wrong about something that's relatively big, the consequences for me are pretty minimal. Whereas in the NFL, there are pretty severe selective pressures where if you're wrong about something, there goes your job. And you look at a lot of coaches, and especially bad coaches, have career spans of a year or two. They don't last very long, and they get replaced by another guy. And maybe that other guy's a bad coach too, but then he'll get replaced. And so there's these very strong selective pressures that are pretty actively weeding out the worst of the worst. And because of these pressures, the average of the whole keeps getting higher and higher and higher because you're getting rid of the worst. You're keeping the Bill Belichicks. You're keeping the Pete Carrolls. You're keeping, the John Harbaughs. And so the average quality of the profession over time rises just because there are these huge selective pressures that you or I don't necessarily face, just because there's not as much money riding on you or I being right or wrong. So if we are right or wrong, it's not like, we're getting canned immediately. Like a lot of, like look at kickers, you can miss, Matt Gay was one of the most accurate kickers in the entire NFL through 13 games. And then he missed 5 kicks in the last 3 games. And now Matt Gay is not in the NFL. 5 kicks. That's it.
Yeah. No, I definitely do have to agree with that one as well. I do think that the whole is definitely getting better, and that's why I think that it pays to start from a point of trying to understand rather than trying to argue with when just looking at this as a whole. And then another interesting point that you did bring up there was the fact that there's pressures not only on the system as a whole, but on these individual coaches, and there's pressures for these coaches to keep their jobs. So if these coaches see 2 players, they understand one of the players has maybe experience that this other player doesn't have. One of the players has maybe this blocking acumen that this other player doesn't have. And maybe if you look at the players side by side from just a physical profile, there's no real reason as to why you would play the quote-unquote lesser player. But the coach, who again wants to keep his job, who doesn't want to move again for the 14th time in the last 5 seasons, will understand that, hey, I want to be here next year.
Right.
And being here next year means I play Tyrod Taylor to start off the season rather than going with what may be more upside or what might be more downside in the alternative. I think as fantasy gamers, oftentimes we always run out to best case scenario with a lot of these guys. We always run out to what could be, and we're not looking at it from the perspective of somebody in the position to actually have their life and their lives' decisions depend on what happens with these guys. So I definitely do hear that as well, and agree with that to 100%.
Yeah, and I've talked before about fantasy owners absolutely should be more tolerant of risk in their decision making. When you're drafting rookies, if you draft a rookie and he busts, that's not a big deal. I mean, half of rookies are going to bust for you anyway. If a coach drafts a rookie and he busts, that might be a new job, especially if it's a rookie quarterback. If you draft Baker Mayfield and Baker Mayfield does not pan out as a professional NFL quarterback, your career is probably going to be very short. And so coaches, understandably, are very, very conservative. Whereas in Dynasty, our incentive structure is just completely different in that in a lot of ways, being above average is the worst possible thing that can happen to you because you don't get the title and you also don't get that 1.01 rookie pick that can turn into Saquon Barkley or Clyde Edwards-Helaire or whoever else the next franchise changing prospect is. So I think the incentive structure in Dynasty is much more to either win big or lose big. If I'm not first, I want to be last.
Yeah, it's completely upside focused with really no incentive to even really think about what might happen looking the other way if things don't necessarily work out as you think that they will. Because, yeah, like you said, you want to be first or last. I mean, Ricky Bobby said it best. That's really the only way that this works because just like in professional sports, the worst thing to be is like a bubble playoff contender because then at the end of the day, you have a team that's good enough to compete, not good enough to win, and never bad enough to go ahead and get what you need to seriously compete for the title. So I definitely think that it pays to have an idea of how you like to structure your teams, of how you like to build your teams. And that's going to lead me directly into the next question. I think we have very similar trade strategies when it comes to kind of looking at the whole. When I'm making a trade in a Dynasty League, and I've said this to listeners on this podcast very, very often. I'm not going to stop saying this until they force me to go ahead and give back the microphone and end this podcast. But what I will say is I don't care about the specific players that I'm trying to go out and get. When I'm trying to go ahead and build a dynasty team, I want archetypes. I want to at least have an idea of where my upside is built in and then work around that rather than trying to get a specific guy to fill this position or that position or the next. For example, I'm completely fine with, I don't know if I'd necessarily even maybe say Carson Wentz. Maybe it was like a middling quarterback that's probably just fine, just, great. Matthew Stafford, perfect. Yeah. Matthew Stafford versus a Patrick Mahomes. In most leagues, I really don't care which one of those guys that I have. I'm happy I have a quarterback, and I know that I can start any of those guys most often pretty much all season. The only difference between those guys is if I have a Patrick Mahomes, then I know, okay, well, I have a Patrick Mahomes. I probably have upside built in at the quarterback spot. I'm probably going to win that matchup most weeks. So when I'm looking at wide receivers, when I'm looking at running backs, maybe instead of getting the guy who's for sure going to get me 12 points, getting the Jarvis Landrys, maybe I'm looking a little bit more at a guy like a Marquise Brown who has the ability to go ahead and give me those huge weeks, but won't necessarily kill me if he gets those 6-point weeks because I know I have a Patrick Mahomes. Whereas if I had a Matthew Stafford, then maybe I want to pad a little bit with floor, only at maybe wide receiver 6, wide receiver 7 on my team. But everyone else, I need to have that upside built in, knowing that I'm not necessarily going to win that matchup at quarterback. I'm going to need to win that matchup somewhere else. I'm just going to use that to tread water. So when I'm building my rosters, what I try to do is I try to understand what I have in terms of just like an archetype level. Is this guy going to be someone that I'm really looking for any ceiling from? Or is this guy going to be someone that I'm looking for floor from? Then I decide if I want to keep him. And if I decide that I want to keep him, I counterbalance with whatever it is that I'm lacking. Do you look at things the same way?
Yeah, for me, it's mostly, I think that there's essentially two types of value in dynasty players. And one is, I call it actual value. It's how many points that player is going to put into your lineup. And I call it actual value because, you play to win the game. You win the game by scoring points. A player's actual direct value to your team is the actual direct points that he puts into your lineup. Someone like Julio Jones has a lot of actual value. He is going to put a lot of extra marginal points in your lineup on a week-to-week basis. And then the other type of value I call perceived value or market value. And that's basically, if I were to trade this player on the open market for another player, how much could he fetch me? And I mean, I came up with these terms a long time ago and I've been using them for a long time. And I kind of regret that it makes it sound like actual value is real value and perceived value is fake value, but that's not the case. They're both 100% real value, because the thing about perceived value is you can use it to buy actual value. Perceived value is basically like money. Actual value is food. You need it to survive. Perceived value is money. You can't eat money, but you can trade money for food. You can trade perceived value for actual value at any time.
Absolutely. I mean, like, for example, A.J. Brown, even though he's injured right now, you can probably get a lot more for A.J. Brown than you will Julio Jones. I can almost guarantee you Julio Jones is going to score more points on your fantasy team over the next couple of seasons than A.J. Brown will. But again, that's the actual value versus the perceived value in just those two players.
Right. And it's like the housing bubble. There were a lot of people who bought a house for $100,000, and then the market got really hot and their house got valued up to $200,000, and then the market burst and their house values back down to $100,000. That equity gain, it's only real value if you sell your house. If you never sell your house, it was all phantom money. It never existed. And so perceived value really only exists when you cash it in. And so my trading philosophy is I also try not to get married to particular players, but I try to have a general sense of how much actual value is this player going to get me? How much is he going to improve my starting lineup? How much is he going to improve my championship odds by me putting him in my starting lineup? And then I look at what's this player's perceived value. And if I estimate that their actual value is higher than their perceived value, I buy them. And if I estimate that their perceived value is higher than their actual value, I sell them. And that's really what it boils down to. Is it's very much a Warren Buffett style value investing, where Warren Buffett and the whole concept of value investing is you buy things that are underpriced and you sell things that are overpriced, and you don't really care what's what. You just care, everything has value at the right price. And so that's kind of me.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Buffett in that is that Buffett is one of the investors that is completely willing to wait it out. He's not necessarily making a move for today. He's not necessarily making a move for next year. He's making a move with the understanding that with the research that he's done to go ahead and buy that stock or do whatever he happens to be doing in that market, he believes that over time, over the long haul, over the long run, there's going to be enough people that either give up on that asset or cash in on that asset that he is going to come out ahead, whether it be 5 years down the line, whether it be 10 years down the line. And that's often a thing that people don't necessarily see in dynasty leagues. They think about today, which is important. Obviously, you want to win that championship. You're not playing to do anything other than win and to enjoy yourself while you're doing it. But at the same time, you do need to be cognizant of the fact that it does make sense to wait oftentimes, because just being able to wait somebody out on a particular prospect really doesn't take anything away from you other than a roster spot while that player sits there and while that player develops on your team. Even though he may not necessarily be getting it done for you, if you have other guys who can go ahead and provide those week-to-week points, you can afford to wait the 4 or 5 years it takes for a Devontae Parker. You can afford to wait the 4 or 5 years it takes for a Corey Davis. But at the same time, I mean, if these guys begin to pop maybe earlier in their careers, maybe then that's a point where you need to also understand, okay, well, let's look at some similar comps to these guys that we've seen before. How did it necessarily turn out? Do we think that this guy's career is going to be vastly different from that guy's? And if that's the case, then yeah, you have a strong asset now, but maybe that asset isn't getting any stronger down the line. So it's just interesting to see how people kind of weigh these decisions and balance these decisions while creating their teams. I wanted to ask you, this is kind of a running joke that's going on right now on Twitter, that Russell Wilson at this point is overrated. I don't necessarily know if he's overrated, if he's underrated. I think he's been underrated for a long time. I think it's going to be a long time until we actually see him being used as the quarterback that he can be used. But, I mean, what are your thoughts on just public perception of players and how that impacts value in Dynasty League specifically?
Well, Kevin Cole on Twitter has been taking up the Russell Wilson is no longer underrated crusade, and based on some of the data that he cites, there's a survey of NFL executives about how good, who rate all the quarterbacks in the NFL, and for years Russell Wilson's like the 8th best quarterback, and only like half of executives are putting him in the top tier. And year after year, that's true. And it's like, okay, Russell Wilson's obviously underrated. And according to Kevin Cole, now he and Mahomes were the only quarterbacks who were 100% in tier 1. So maybe Russell Wilson is fairly rated at this point. But to me, it's the whole meta argument is very uninteresting to me. I'm not really interested in debating what other people's mental states are. And a lot of times the underrated, overrated argument gets to that point where it's like, well, I agree how good Russell Wilson is, and you agree how good Russell Wilson is. But I don't think that these people who I've never met and never spoken to understand exactly how good Russell Wilson is. I think maybe they think he's not as good. And so other than times where it's pretty blatant, I lived in Dallas for a while, and I had multiple people. This is not one crazy person. I had multiple people suggest to me that Dallas should bench Tony Romo so that they could see what they had in Kyle Orton. That was a genuine thing that people suggested to me. And at that point, yes, I'm very comfortable saying that Tony Romo is underrated. When you are one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL and your fan base, your own supporters want you benched for Kyle Orton, that to me, it's a very unambiguous case that you're underrated. Whether Russell Wilson is still underrated or overrated at this point in NFL circles, I don't really know. He's really, really good. He's one of the top 4 quarterbacks in the NFL. If consensus has him there, then he's fairly rated. If it doesn't, then he's underrated. I do think he's been perpetually underrated in dynasty circles. And I think a lot of that is just this whole belief that Pete Carroll runs such a run-heavy offense that he can't be, I think there's this belief that he's a really good NFL quarterback, but not a very good dynasty quarterback. Not a very good fantasy quarterback. And it's kind of a weird belief because I think he has the most fantasy points of any quarterback over the last 5 years. He's got, a number 1 fantasy quarterback finish to his name, a number of top 3 fantasy quarterback finishes. So yes, Pete Carroll runs a very run heavy offense, but I don't know if people just don't realize. And I guess based on consistent redraft ADP, maybe people just don't realize how good and productive he is. But for some reason, I do tend to find he's pretty consistently underrated in dynasty and in fantasy leagues. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the same thing could have been said for Dak Prescott for many years, kind of leading up to this year when I think finally people are starting to kind of turn the corner and understand that, hey, well, when you put Russell Wilson's career and Dak Prescott's career side by side, they look eerily similar, at least for the first 3 seasons or so. I think people are finally kind of getting on the bandwagon on the train of, okay, well, maybe we've been wrong on Dak this entire time as well. And that's provided some real windows into value for people that were willing to kind of invest a little bit early when these quarterbacks were thought of as, second tier assets or as low end QB1s or as, high end QB2s, guys that you really didn't need to spend a whole lot of capital to go out and get. I wanted to ask you right now, other than Russell, other than Dak, is there a guy or two out there that you think that the dynasty community or just the fantasy community, even if it's the redraft community as a whole, kind of has a little bit wrong, just based on kind of maybe what you've seen in the past from a similar player?
So one guy I've been on recently, and I think he's a little bit of a blind spot. I'll admit he was a blind spot for me, and I traded for him, not targeting him in particular, but like I said, I try to be pretty open to trades, and I was talking with the league mate, and I just felt that value was there, so I traded for him. And then once I had him, I do a lot of analysis of my own roster, and I'm doing the analysis of my roster, and I'm checking out redraft ranks on him and dynasty ranks on him, and I'm like, wait a minute, there's a bit of a disconnect here. But one guy who I've been on recently is Josh Jacobs. And so Josh Jacobs is a very highly drafted NFL running back. He went very high in the 2019 NFL draft. He had a phenomenal rookie season, very productive, looked really, really good, was widely acclaimed. He's 22 years old right now. You would think that this would be the sort of guy that dynasty owners would be going crazy over. But as I was doing my research, the big red flag to me was he was actually rated higher on average in redraft rankings than he was in dynasty rankings, which makes no sense. Let's just put that out there. You have a super talented, very, very, very young running back with total job security, who the redraft community is saying is going to be extremely productive this season. And the dynasty community is saying, yeah, we're a little lukewarm on him. And one exercise I like to do is I think redraft is a simpler game than dynasty. Obviously, there's a lot fewer variables, and I think it's a more solvable game. I think that redraft projections tend to be more accurate than dynasty projections for obvious reasons. So one game I like to play is if these redraft consensus rankings are correct, what is the dynasty community going to think about this player a year from now? And so you had a dynasty community that had Josh Jacobs maybe at like the 8th, 9th, 10th running back overall. And think about it. If you have a guy who is 22 years old, very highly drafted, finishes as a top 5, top 6 NFL running back, where is he going to be going a year from now? He's going to be going a lot higher than 9th or 10th. And so, yeah, I was looking into that. I look at Football Guys has rest of season projections, and we currently have him, I think, as running back number 5 in the rest of season projections. Maybe 4. I don't know. The only guys who are clearly ahead of him are Christian McCaffrey, obviously, and then he's kind of in a group with like Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, and Josh Jacobs. And my thing is, if Jacobs is 3 years younger than Ezekiel Elliott and as productive as Ezekiel Elliott right now, why would I prefer Ezekiel Elliott to him in Dynasty? Why? I mean, even ignoring the fact that Ezekiel Elliott is basically one domestic abuse situation away from getting a lifetime ban from the NFL. He's got these other risks surrounding him as well. But so Josh Jacobs is one guy who I've kind of been looking into, and I'm a little bit confused by. To me, and I'll admit it was my blind spot too, because I didn't really think about Josh Jacobs that much until the trade was there and I got it and I'm looking into it and I'm like, why would I have him anywhere but number 3 in my running back rankings? So that's my top 3 are Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, and I feel super comfortable with that.
And I don't think you're wrong with that at all, because I think one of the reasons that the Dynasty community kind of maybe has these blind spots, so to speak, is because, again, that information overload that I alluded to in the first point. All the information surrounding Josh Jacobs this offseason was that, okay, well, this guy isn't going to catch a pass. This guy didn't catch passes in his rookie seasons. There's 3 guys behind him that can catch passes. How is he going to catch passes? If he doesn't catch passes, then how is he going to be a good running back? And I think that's hilarious, because we just saw a guy not catch passes and end up being a very, very, very productive running back in Derrick Henry just last season. One of the things that made Josh Jacobs such a buy to me, and such a cornerstone of a few of my teams that I've actually gone out and traded for him before this season, was the simple fact that Josh Jacobs was locked into the Josh Jacobs role on that offense. A lot of people looked at all the other backs on that roster and said, okay, well, they're all going to take away receiving work from him. Okay, that's fine. Let's just assume that that's true. Let's assume every pass in the Oakland backfield goes to a running back other than Josh Jacobs. Every carry in the Oakland backfield is going to go to Josh Jacobs, because the other running backs behind him are only pass catchers. That's their only skill above what Josh Jacobs can do. And then I thought about it further and I was like, okay, and even that is kind of hilarious, because when you go just a year on back to college, what Josh Jacobs was known for was catching the football. So I just don't think that the Dynasty community can really get it out of their heads when it's told to them by so many different people, by so many different pundits, by so many different talking heads. This is the thing that matters. This is the thing you should be focused on. And everything else that contradicts this thing is maybe something you should place to the side. I think that is just a glaring example of one of the things that you can kind of find an edge on in your league in looking at these situations as a whole. I think Will Fuller is another one. We can go on and on about that when it comes to injury concerns, but we're biased against so many players because we have so many smart people saying things on Twitter, and we leave the thinking to them. But I think at some point you kind of have to understand, and you kind of have to aggregate all of these things being said by all of these people, sit down, look at the situation as a whole, and then kind of make a decision based on, well, what makes the most sense of it all.
Yeah, and so my fantasy football philosophy and strategy and just my whole approach to the game is heavily influenced by a guy named Gerd Gigerenzer. And he, some of your listeners might be familiar with Daniel Kahneman. He wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. He's done a lot of research on cognitive biases. And he's become kind of a very big name in this whole pop psychology space. And Gerd Gigerenzer was kind of one of his contemporaries. And he talks a lot about heuristics and rules of thumb. And a lot of people think that these heuristics are faulty and flawed and they lead to cognitive bias. But Gigerenzer finds that a lot of times in extremely uncertain circumstances and situations, simpler rules of thumb tend to perform better. Like if you're in a very tightly defined game like chess, very complicated rules can make a lot of sense. But if you're in a much broader game like the stock market, where the rules are not always necessarily clear and the range of outcomes can't be anticipated. Sometimes there's a pandemic and like all of your stocks that you made very reasonable bets on are all tanking because you didn't realize that, like a disease was going to jump from a bat to a dude somewhere in China, and then all of a sudden the entire world was going to shut down. The stock market is a world with unbounded uncertainty, and in situations like that, often the best performing rules are the simplest. Like you can, and so one of my simple rules in Dynasty, I call it the Dr. Ian Malcolm hypothesis from Jurassic Park. And it's life finds a way, and that's basically the idea is that talented players are going to produce. You can point to get me a talented player. All right, like let's say CD Lamb, and you look at CD Lamb and he lands in Dallas, and people are like, well, but how is he going to produce? Because Amari Cooper is there and Michael Gallup is there, and both of those guys are super young and they're going to be there for a long time. And how are there going to be enough balls to go around for CD Lamb to produce? And my answer is life finds a way. I don't know. I can't tell you. Maybe Amari Cooper gets hurt. Maybe gets traded. Maybe, Michael Gallup winds up being a bust and last year was a mirage. Maybe Dak Prescott starts throwing for 6,000 yards a year. I don't know. All I know is that over time, we've seen, you look at Larry Fitzgerald, he's playing with the worst quarterback collection that we've ever seen. And everybody's like, oh, Larry Fitzgerald's done. And then he gets Carson Palmer and he gets Bruce Arians a couple years later, and he's back to having 1,000-yard seasons because life finds a way. And so it's a really, really useful rule of thumb for me because, as I mentioned at the top, I am extraordinarily lazy. And it saves me a lot of effort because I don't have to go through the whole, like, is Theo Riddick going to stick in Oakland and catch a lot of passes? And what's Jalen Richards' role going to be? And how does Lynn Bowden fit into all of this? I can just say life finds a way. And I think Josh Jacobs is really talented. And I think over time that talent is going to show and is going to translate into production. So I don't need to connect the dots to get from A to B. I can just say, I think that this is going to work itself out somehow, some way down the line.
I 100% agree with that. And honestly, I think the only reason that he was even acquirable over this offseason was because that he was hurt over the last 3 or 4 games of last season, which kind of gave people a bad taste in their mouth because it was right when the fantasy playoffs were really kind of rolling in and people didn't have him for that. It was kind of like the Melvin Gordon syndrome. He did so well for you to get you there and then didn't get you there. And now you're kind of left with nothing, and you're left with that hole in your heart where Josh Jacobs used to be. And so you kind of have that different perception of him coming into the season. I do think that that's an edge for gamers. I wanted to talk just about just edges as a whole. Obviously, there's the edge of not being too focused on whatever the current situation is, knowing that that situation can change, knowing that life can find a way. There's the edge of maybe going ahead and buying some players that people think are maybe a little bit too old or maybe past their prime that can give you that value today that's going to go ahead and allow you to go ahead and develop talent on your roster. Maybe there's an edge here, there, or somewhere else that somebody else might have something to say. But I want to ask you, what do you think the largest edge or the biggest edge is, or where do you think that comes from in terms of just a total line of thought in Dynasty Leagues today? Where is the collective community blind spot?
I would say probably just acknowledging uncertainty. I think people get their opinions, and that's good. That's right. That's important. Everybody should have their opinions. But I don't think you should necessarily be married to your opinions. I think you should be very open to the possibility that you're wrong. And if you had 1 million dynasty teams, and each of those 1 million dynasty teams made 100 trades where they were winning according to market value. You know, if you had consensus dynasty ADP and every trade was a trade where you were gaining more value than you gave up. It doesn't matter the particulars. It doesn't matter who you traded away. It doesn't matter who you gave up. A lot of those trades will be bad. You're going to wind up trading, you know, Patrick Mahomes for Baker Mayfield at some point. Who knows? But over time, I guarantee you those teams will get better on the whole, because basically you're trading 4th round players for 3rd round players, for 2nd round players, for 1st round players. And the dynasty market is not perfect, but it is good enough that 1st round players tend to be better than 2nd round players, who tend to be better than 3rd round players, who tend to be better than 4th round players. And so I think it takes a little bit of humility to say, I don't really like this player, but the community really likes this player and I'm getting a great discount on him. And so I'm going to make this move anyway. I'm going to, you know, I was not going out and looking to buy Josh Jacobs when I went out and bought Josh Jacobs. It was just an opportunity presented itself. And I didn't really have a strong opinion about Josh Jacobs, but I felt that the value was there. And I think that there's an edge to be had in just being a little bit humble about who you like and who you don't like. Joe Bryant at Football Guys has a saying that, you know, everybody has value. At some point, everybody has value. There's a guy who you might think does not present value in the 10th round, but if he's still there in the 20th round, he's a value. You know, there's a guy who maybe is not a value in the 20th round, but if you're in a 32 team fantasy league with 53 man rosters, you know, at some point you're going to draft that guy, and that guy is going to be a positive value for your team. Everybody has a value, and winning in fantasy is getting the guys who are values, whether you necessarily are excited about them, whether you necessarily like them, just get the guys who are values. And I'll say, you know, if you're right about their value, you're going to come to like them. You're going to get pretty excited about them once they start scoring points, you know, on your bench or in your lineup. But just I think being open to the idea that maybe you're wrong. Maybe community consensus can be right. Maybe NFL decision makers know something. Maybe there are other smart people playing this game, and we can kind of cheat off their homework from time to time and make our jobs a little bit easier.
Yeah. I mean, it's all relative to cost. Ultimately, this is what it comes down to. So if you're looking at a player and maybe you don't like a player, maybe you're not a fan of a player, okay, but if that a player is available way later than he should have been, according to ADP, I mean, ultimately, the wisdom of the crowd, at least for the first part of the season, is probably more accurate than whatever your projections are at home anyway. So it pays to at least ride the wave where you can. And I find myself kind of getting these ugly running backs over and over and over and over again on my teams because they go out of favor really, really quickly. They shine bright oftentimes, and then they die hard oftentimes. Yeah. I think David Johnson, what he potentially could be this year, is kind of a perfect example of that, of a player that, I mean, nobody really wanted. Nobody really wants at this point that could potentially be a solid low-end RB1, high-end RB2 asset that was pretty much passed up by everyone at the draft. Leonard Fournette was that last year. We don't necessarily know what the split between Rojo and Leonard Fournette is going to be in Tampa this year, but I mean, that's a situation where I think you can get outsized rewards by acquiring that guy that nobody wants right now just because of what could happen. Oftentimes, like you said, people are too confident in what they think or what the community thinks is going to happen that they accept it as a fact rather than a percentage in terms of probability. So I do think that is probably where I find my biggest edges in Dynasty. And the reason that I do that at the running back position is because I'm always drafting wide receivers high because I just want to keep my window open for as long as physically possible and kind of figure it out after that.
Yeah, Ronald Jones is an interesting one. He was the first guy this offseason where I'm doing the roster evals, and I'm like, why is Ronald Jones, who is a 23-year-old highly drafted running back, being drafted higher in redraft leagues than dynasty leagues? If a guy's that young, they really shouldn't ever be going higher in redraft than in dynasty. And some might say, okay, sure, looks like the dynasty community was right because look, Bruce Arians went out and signed Leonard Fournette. Yeah, maybe. Ronald Jones got like 75% of the workload in week 1. Maybe not. I tend to think that Jones is going to be the guy in that backfield. But just in general, and the specifics, that's the nice thing about, I think, outsourcing so much of your thinking is you're not as married to the take. And maybe I was wrong about Ronald Jones. I was praising him over the summer as somebody like, it just doesn't make any sense for him to be as cheap as he is in Dynasty. And maybe I'm wrong. I'm wrong quite frequently. The goal is never 100% hit rate. I think if 100% of your opinions are correct, you don't have enough opinions. You could have, basically you're only going for the surest of sure things. You could have some opinions that are marginally sure things that are 80% right, right 80% of the time, and it's going to decrease your batting average, but you'll still have more net value in the long run. So maybe I was wrong about Ronald Jones. I'm not especially broken up if I was. I tend to think that he's still going to have something to say about the 2020 season. But just in general, yeah, the Dynasty community, for some reason, falls out of love with players, falls into love with players. And they kind of, I don't know, they kind of, I don't want to say they get married to the take, but they get very invested in that take. And sometimes I think they are a little slow to move off of it again.
Yeah, a willingness to be wrong, a willingness to kind of go against the grain, knowing that maybe the analysis that you put together may not necessarily match up to the analysis that's out there in the community, but knowing that you could be wrong in this circumstance, but being right in this circumstance would mean outsized rewards, I think for me means that I want to lean into risk as much as possible most often in trades and in dynasty leagues. And yes, I'm going to get in the scenario where this is a real life thing that happened to me. This was my first year in dynasty. I thought I had a decent team. I did not, but again, this was my first year in dynasty. So I'm trying to go for the championship. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm only a wide receiver away from having one of the best lineups in this league. All I need to do is go ahead and trade my first round pick for 1,000-yard receiver Jordan Matthews. So I did that. And it turns out that first round pick turned into 104 in that league. Little known guy. I think he plays for the Carolina Panthers. I think he might be the most highest paid running back in the National Football League. Happens to fall to 104. So essentially I traded Jordan Matthews for Christian McCaffrey in that league. And I lived to kind of tell the tale of it because the next year, or maybe a couple years down the line, I did the same thing by acquiring Tyreek Hill when nobody necessarily knew whether or not Tyreek Hill was going to come back and play. I think it makes the most sense to me to take as many shots as possible, be fine losing some shots, but just knowing that if you do hit, it's going to make up for the past 10 misses in trades. So I'm constantly trying to churn, just trying to play the odds at being right enough to just keep my head above water and finding out that works more often than not.
Yeah, I've got a thread up on Twitter of some of the brutal, horrible trades I've made over the years. Like I traded Brandon Marshall and a first for Percy Harvin, and then like Harvin never played again. I traded last offseason. I traded Chris Godwin for Sony Michel straight up. And they're just horrible, awful trades. And you look at them and you think, if I hadn't made that trade, how much better would my team be today? It would be a lot better. But you also have to say, if I wasn't the person who was willing to make that trade, I also wouldn't have been the person who was willing to make the other trades that I made. And so, yes, last offseason, I traded Chris Godwin for Sony Michel, and it was an unmitigated disaster. I also traded Alvin Kamara and a second for Christian McCaffrey, and I won the league as a result. And I don't think I can say, there's not a version of me who doesn't make the Godwin trade, but who still makes the Kamara and the McCaffrey trade. The Chris Godwin for Sony Michel trades are the price of entry. That's just something you're going to have to live with as the price you pay to be the kind of person who can make the other trades too. And it's not really a clean accounting. I go back and I look at all my trades and I add them all up, and I have the bad trades in one hand and the good trades in the other hand. And I think, like on net, is my team better as a result of these trades? And I don't know that it's a clean accounting, but I can look at my team and I can say, I think my team's in a pretty good place. And I make peace with all of the moves that I made that got me to that place, the good moves as well as the bad moves.
The important thing is to have the willingness to make the moves in the first place, because the other side of that is being kind of stuck in fear. And what that means is that you're only drafting, you're only having guys that you drafted on your team, and you kind of ride them out. And if they happen to turn out great, then great, you won. If they happen to not turn out well, then you're drafting to draft over players that you just recently drafted. It seems like you're always spinning your wheels. So at some point, you need to be willing to lose in order to even have the possibility of winning in dynasty leagues, especially. What I wanted to ask you, really, before we go ahead and go into this week's Dynasty Diagnostic, which is just going to be looking at a listener submitted roster and kind of seeing what we would do with this particular roster, what are some of the biggest things that do cause you to start to have some concerns about specific players? You just mentioned that you're not super interested in the situations because you do understand that situations change, but you also mentioned that you believe talent will find a way. What is talent to you? What epitomizes talent to you? And when do you get to the point where that is outweighed by some other factor that makes you start to maybe want to go the opposite direction on a given player?
So there's this really interesting phenomenon where basically a rookie wide receiver, no matter what he does, is going to be as valuable or more valuable heading into year two. And there's virtually nothing a rookie wide receiver can do to see their value decrease. And the example I give is N'Keal Harry. N'Keal Harry had a catastrophic rookie season. He's a healthy scratch from the Patriots lineup, which virtually never happens to first round wide receivers. It did not look good on the field. N'Keal Harry's dynasty value went up. I mean, it was higher this August than it was last August, or it was basically the same at worst. And it's pretty consistent. It's not that there's nothing they can do. In the really extreme cases, AJ Jenkins, John Baldwin, yes, their value will go down. But this tells me two things. This tells me either rookie wide receivers are undervalued because we're not pricing in the fact there's no downside risk here. After a year, even if they don't do anything, you can at the very worst get your investment back. So there's no downside risk, which tells me, rookie wide receivers are undervalued. And it tells me that it's quite possible that second year wide receivers, and especially second year wide receivers who underperformed in their first year, are probably overvalued. Because again, it doesn't make sense that N'Keal Harry could perform poorly by any measure and not see his value drop. It seems that as new information comes in, we should be updating our beliefs and his value should be going down. So one thing that I love rookie wide receivers. I love draft picks most of all, because draft picks never get hurt. Draft picks never hold out. Draft picks don't take up a roster spot. Draft picks are very, very, very safe places to park your value. I was talking about the actual value and the perceived value. And draft picks are the ultimate storehouse of perceived value. Their value is never going to go down. But after draft picks, I really like rookie wide receivers. And I think after we have a few really, really good rookie drafts in a row, like we've had basically since 2017, draft pick values tend to be a little too high. I think people tend to overvalue their draft picks. And so I like buying young wide receivers. And then if they don't do much their first season, I pretty aggressively sell them off because they no longer have that magical aura of invincibility where no matter what they do, their value is going to survive. So I like buying young wide receivers and giving them a year and seeing basically it's an audition and they need to convince me to keep them. And if they don't convince me to keep them, then I'll just sell and I can usually recoup value on that. So yeah, that's I'd say that's a big thing that a player can get me to do. A player can do to get me to move on, and that's kind of reached that point where I know any negative shock at this point is going to cause their perceived value to go into free fall. And I don't like exposing myself to that kind of risk where just I'm one bad news report from losing a substantial fraction of my roster's total perceived value.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I think exactly where a guy like Leonard Fournette is right now. Yes, it could go right, and then yes, it could also go in the direction where it turns out he's not the guy, and then he's in a loaded free agent class with a bunch of rookie running backs coming out that aren't going to be as expensive as he is next year, and we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. I think it's being at that precipice of, like you said, knowing when the bottom is about to fall out, that you want to go ahead and make sure that you pull all your assets out of that completely. But exactly what you said about rookie picks is kind of where I just smile, because I just made a trade this offseason. A guy essentially accepted a first-round pick for Tyler Boyd. It was 107 or 108 in the league. And so I kind of went through a lot of mocks and kind of what I saw at the 107, 108. The 107, 108 was a guy by the name of Justin Jefferson. I look at Justin Jefferson's profile and I look at Tyler Boyd's profile, and I was like, okay, well, I mean, as prospects, maybe Justin Jefferson has a little bit more athleticism, but these guys are similar players. They both play in the slot. They're both, you hope they're going to be high volume receivers. You hope both of these guys are maybe going to get a little bit better at finding the end zone going on and into the future. But I mean, essentially, if if Justin Jefferson works out, if he does everything that you want him to do, he's Tyler Boyd. Right. So when I actually made that trade, I felt like there's no real risk there, but a lot of people don't see that because they put that extra emphasis on having that rookie draft pick.
Well, and it's funny because, the 2008 running back class was historically good. I would have said it was the best running back class in history, but then 2017 happened, and that was actually probably better. But it's probably the second best running back class of the last 30 years. And then after 2008, we really hit, like a huge dry spell, especially for running backs. There were good receivers. We had Demaryius Thomas, Dez Bryant, AJ Green, and Julio Jones came in 2010 and 2011. And then we had the 2014 receiver class. But by and large, rookie drafts were not producing like a ton of top end, super valuable dynasty players, and especially immediately valuable dynasty players. And so kind of as a result, people kind of forgot that rookie picks could be good. And I found in my leagues that rookie picks tended to be available really quite cheaply. And I could package guys, like Steve Johnson and a LaDainian Tomlinson on the New York Jets. I traded for a first because somebody needed to fill some holes in his lineup. And at the time, firsts were not producing good players. So he was happy to give it. I traded James Jones for a first at one point. And so I used to be able to get first round picks very cheaply. And then I think 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 happened. And everybody's like, wow, you can get some really, really good picks in the rookie draft. And now everybody wants all the first and everybody's trying to buy them. And so now we see trades that are crazy the other way, where like I saw Derrick Henry traded for a first, not this offseason, but last offseason before he had his monster year. But still, you're getting firsts are fetching much higher prices than they used to. And so that's kind of why I pivoted more to young wide receivers, just because I think they're a little bit, it's a cheaper place to try and buy and park some value than trying to buy future firsts now that everybody wants them because everybody wants to get the next Christian McCaffrey.
Absolutely. Man, I really enjoyed this conversation. I am going to get to the part of the show that I know the people are here for. We've already done the 5-point inspection, ladies and gentlemen. Now we're going to plug in the analyzer and get to this week's Dynasty Diagnostic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually tell you a team. This is going to be a listener-submitted roster. We're just going to talk through some of the things that we might do to get this team more competitive, or some of the things we might keep the same to make sure that this team stays as is. But we're going to do what we do at the Dynasty Diagnostic shop, and we're going to chop and change what we need to here to get this ready to go out and win this year's races. So it is a 12-team, 1 quarterback, 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, 1 tight end, 2 flex league with 13 bench spots. No real crazy rules except point 1 for pass completion. So I think that's one thing that's a little bit different. And then also a -2 for interception rule and a 4-point passing TD league. All right, so again, it's a 1 quarterback league, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the quarterbacks listed here, but it's Jared Goff and it's Derek Carr. Derek Carr, I think there's a whole bunch of uncertainty as to what Derek Carr could potentially be into the future, just because of, number one, what's looking at him now in Marcus Mariota. I think Marcus Mariota and Ryan Tannehill, even though Marcus Mariota is on the IR right now, I think Marcus Mariota and Ryan Tannehill, what happened between those 2 quarterbacks could very easily happen to Marcus Mariota and Derek Carr in Oakland this year. And even if it doesn't necessarily work out that way, I do think that there is some danger as to what happens when Derek Carr is off his contract. He has no more dead cap on his contract. There's really no more certainty that ties him to that team. When you look at the other side of the coin entirely, Jared Goff, he's there for at least 3 more seasons. There's almost nothing that the Rams can do to get him off their books for the next 3 seasons. I do say this. I said the same thing about Todd Gurley and Brandon Cooks as well. And look at what the Rams are paying them in dead cap. So again, I'm accepting my ability to be wrong in this scenario, but it looks like these are guys that are going in opposite directions. I wanted to ask you, am I a little bit too down on Derek Carr in this outlook? Am I a little bit too high on Jared Goff on his, or is this about the way you see both of these guys as well?
Oh, I think you're probably right on Derek Carr, but I think you're way too high on Marcus Mariota. I think, he didn't really look that good in Tennessee. Reports where he didn't really look that good in Oakland. I kind of don't see there being much of a challenge to Derek Carr in the short term on that roster. But the problem with Derek Carr is that he's so afraid of making a mistake that he's unwilling to make a play. He's sort of like bizarro Jameis Winston, where Jameis Winston would make a million mistakes if it meant making a play. And so he had, tons of interceptions and he took some sacks, but Jameis Winston moved the ball down the field. Jameis Winston got lots of first downs. Derek Carr doesn't take sacks. Derek Carr doesn't get interceptions, but he doesn't move the ball down the field either. And that's, in my mind, even a worse sin for a quarterback than Jameis Winston. So I would worry about Derek Carr as a long-term option. I kind of view him very similar to somebody like Andy Dalton. And I think a similar fate could befall him. I would not be shocked if years from now, Derek Carr was one of the best backup quarterbacks in the NFL. Jared Goff, I tend to be with you that he's a nice, stable starting quarterback. You're going to get several years out of him. I don't think there's going to be really any surprises with Goff. There's potential for upside, especially given how many good receivers the Rams have right now. But I think for the most part, he's just a solid, reliable, long-term, low-end starting quarterback for fantasy.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much on the same page with that one. Like I said, it is a 1 quarterback league. So for me, a Jared Goff, just like what I was talking about before, like a Matthew Stafford, you're going to tread water at that spot. You're going to win some weeks. You're going to lose some weeks. It's not really going to matter too much for you. You're going to be competitive at that spot enough to go ahead and chase upside elsewhere. Just know that if you have a guy like Jared Goff starting in that position, you're going to need to have upside somewhere else. You're going to need to stray away from the wide receiver who's maybe going to catch 10 passes and go for the wide receiver who might catch 3 passes. With those 3 passes, 2 of those will go for touchdowns. The other one's a 30-yard completion down the sideline. You're going to need the upside somewhere else to make up for a potential loss of upside at that QB spot. So let's move on into running backs. At running backs, the new hotness, Jonathan Taylor, is starting off on the roster. Darrell Williams behind him, Joshua Kelly, David Montgomery, and Raquel Armstead. For me, this running back group is probably about one guy short of something that I would be comfortable with. You can say what you want to say about David Montgomery. I think he's going to be an RB2 on volume alone on that team, assuming Allen Robinson is a Chicago Bear for the remainder of the season, which is not something that I even thought that I'd be talking about at this point, but look where we are. Joshua Kelly, I think he's shown that he's going to have a split with Austin Eckler that is Melvin Gordon-esque. I think he's going to have some value, so I think he could be a solid RB3 in this league. And Jonathan Taylor, I mean, this unfortunately, what happened to Marlon Mack is best case scenario for Jonathan Taylor. Now he's going to be thrust into the starting position that he was probably going to have to take 3 to 4, maybe 5 weeks to go ahead and earn in Indianapolis behind one of the best offensive lines in football. Is this enough for you, or do you think that you need at least one more guy? And is there a specific type of player that you'd be looking to plug into this roster to kind of round it out to something that you would enjoy putting out there every week?
Well, one of my mottos is fantasy football isn't won by the team with the strongest weaknesses. It's won by the team with the strongest strengths. And so I've seen fantasy teams win championships trotting out the equivalent of Reichwell Armstead at their running back 2 position. You know, I've played in championship games with Brandon Weeden at quarterback. It's not a question of not having holes somewhere. I would rather have a team that has true exceptional difference makers and also a couple holes than a team that's got a solid, dependable starter at every position, because the difference makers are so disproportionately valuable. So, you ask if I would be comfortable. Absolutely, I'd be comfortable. We'll have to wait and see if he's got any of those difference makers at the wide receiver position. If he doesn't have some top-notch difference makers somewhere else on the roster, then yeah, this is probably a running back core where I'm probably looking to retool and add some extra youth. And I think it's good that the depth that he has here is mostly, or she has here, is mostly youth, because it does sound sort of like the running back core of somebody who might be a year away still.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the right way to look at this as a whole. I mentioned archetypes earlier when I look to kind of construct dynasty rosters and looking for a specific type of player. With a Jonathan Taylor, I think you have your kind of all-purpose RB1 do-it-all type of dude who's going to be pretty consistent for you and still be able to give you those boom weeks. I think you're probably going to see Big Chubb-like numbers from Jonathan Taylor sooner rather than later, and that's going to be the majority of what you see for as long as he's the starter out there in Indianapolis. But behind him, I don't necessarily see anyone that I would be so attached to. The one thing that I don't see on this roster, though, is a dedicated pass-catching running back, a dedicated floor guy that you kind of know is just going to get those 8 points and maybe a carry or two during the game. That's going to give you a pretty solid base of 10 points every game on this roster. So I'd be looking to go out and get somebody who's a little bit more of a pass catcher, maybe somebody like a Nyheim Hines, who probably is going to be a little bit undervalued in your league, even though he did have a decent game one, just because Phillip Rivers likes to throw to running backs and likes to throw to tight ends. I'd be looking for James White. I'd be looking for someone that, is kind of your break glass in case of emergency type running back on this team, on a PPR roster that's going to go ahead and just give you a floor if everything falls out for you. Is there a type of guy that you'd be looking at that way, or does that not matter as much to you?
Yeah, I don't know. I because I tend to anchor so much to other people's rankings and to consensuses, my teams tend to be pretty much chameleons. I don't know that I really have a type so much as, my type is undervalued. I had Theo Riddick for years just because people always undervalued, Theo Riddick's available for free. And it's like, well, I've had Theo Riddick the last 2 years, but if you're going to give him to me for free again, sure, I'll have him for a third year in a row. And yeah, it's possible Hines or maybe like a Tariq Cohen is that guy. I don't know. I think most of my leagues have caught on to the Theo Riddicks of the world, and I don't think I can pull off that trick anymore. Or Danny Woodhead back in the day. It really just depends on your league. But yeah, my type is whoever I think they'll give me for less than he's worth.
Hey man, where there's J.D. McKissick, there is a way. All right, so at wide receiver, we have Cooper Kupp leading off, Cortland Sutton, Sterling Shepard, Allen Lazard, Curtis Samuel, Ryan Edwards, Michael Pittman, Corey Davis, Traquan Smith, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, T. Higgins, and Andy Isabella. And we talked earlier about perceived value versus actual value. I think Cooper Kupp at this point is actual value, even though whether or not he's going to get the same volume of targets he's seen in the last couple of seasons is kind of up for debate at this point so far with what we've seen and what we saw at the end of last season. I do think that Cortland Sutton is sooner rather than later going to be a top 12 wide receiver in the National Football League. Even with struggling Drew Lock, even with some of the other targets in that offense, I just think he is that alpha type of receiver. But beyond that, I see a bunch of guys that could, not necessarily a bunch of guys that I'd feel 100% comfortable with starting week in, week out. Do you think that this is a receiving core that you'd be willing to kind of wait out, or are you looking to shore it up with a specific type of purchase to get it closer to something that you'd be willing to go ahead and ride in?
I'll say what I really like about this team, as you read more names off it, I think this GM is somebody who has a very clear vision for what he or she wants to do with their franchise, and I don't think there's really any dissonance. It's a team I don't think that has a bunch of redraft year one difference makers. I think if you look at redraft ADP, it's going to say that probably not a title favorite this year, but it's okay with me because I'm not really hearing any old players on the roster. I'm not hearing any players who are really at risk of seeing very significant value declines. This is the kind of roster where you can afford to wait for a little bit. There's a lot of young, talented, high upside prospects here who I think are exactly the sort of players that should be rostered here. Who, you have the luxury of time to wait and watch them develop. And so I definitely keep steering into that. If I were acquiring anyone else, I probably would not be looking to add a Julio Jones, because I don't know that Julio Jones is the piece that puts you over the top. And I think you would spend too much future value, which is probably, I think that's the strength of the team is this team's youth, and the prospects for the future. And so I would not steer away from that. I would steer into that, and I would keep focusing on younger players, especially higher drafted players in the NFL. One thing I would look at is a lot of cheap wide receivers who are maybe in the last year of their contract or who could potentially be playing for different teams next year. Because you a lot of times will see somebody like Emmanuel Sanders, who was relatively highly regarded, but just really fizzled in Pittsburgh, just mainly because of fit. It was just a poor fit for him. And then he landed with another team and had a career renaissance. And so I think even somebody like a John Ross was very highly regarded by the Bengals. And you hear from the beat writers that he does a lot of good things on that team, but he's sort of kind of been lost in the wash. And he's somebody who could, maybe be available for free. And there's always that chance that he lands somewhere else in the next year or two and his value is unlocked. And so I think that's a nice low risk, high upside play that kind of fits the overall vision of the roster so far.
How are you playing the Corey Davis game? This scenario that we have so far presented this year is Corey Davis might actually have a Devontae Parker-esque type renaissance just because of the lack of healthy bodies around him. A.J. Brown, he's out with injury. We don't necessarily think that besides A.J. Brown and Johnny Smith and Corey Davis on that team that there's really that much target competition. So if he does do well, if he does ball out in pretty much devoid of any competition on that team, how are you looking at his value moving forward? Would you take that kind of for what it's worth and just assume that, okay, well, maybe this might be the new normal that we didn't see? Or would you kind of put a lot more credence onto the fact that, yes, he did do this, but he also did this in a very specific set of circumstances, kind of like Evan Ingram had in his rookie year and kind of was the only game in town and has had his value kind of propped up since then. How would you play that game with a guy like Corey Davis? Are you buying or selling?
Well, so especially at wide receiver, like later breakouts are not really that unusual. And you mentioned Devontae Parker, but there's a lot of wide receivers who had later breakouts, and a lot of times it's precipitated by a team change. And usually the ones that are precipitated by a team change, they tend to be pretty durable. Emmanuel Sanders changed teams and was suddenly good. And it wasn't a fluke. It was just, he was a poor fit with his old team. He found a new team that he was a good fit with, and that unlocked value. And there's a lot of examples of this. You could go back to Joe Horn I believe he was with Kansas City, and he did nothing. And then he went to the Saints, and he was, he was a top fantasy wide receiver. I think like the most dramatic example of a late breakout is Drew Hill back in the 70s and 80s. And he played, I think like 6 years with the Rams and did nothing. Like, I don't think he even topped 400 yards at any point. And then he went to Houston and joined up with Warren Moon and the run and shoot. And he's just a perennial 1,000-yard receiver. And I think it was like an age 29 or age 30 breakout. And so you see that a lot at wide receiver. Most wide receivers who are bad through 3 years are just bad wide receivers. If you hear a hoofbeat, think horses, not zebras. But it's not at all uncommon to have later breakouts, especially when the facts on the ground change. So if Corey Davis actually delivers and continues producing like he has so far, I'm not going to be too skeptical of that, because that's a pretty normal fact pattern for wide receivers. I wouldn't necessarily be betting on it at this point. That's one where I'm going to have to wait until he shows me more, just because, I think the difference to me between Corey Davis and John Ross, first of all, is John Ross is free and Corey Davis typically is not free at this point. He still costs something. I think he costs a lot less than he has over the years, but he still costs something. And I'm much more likely to gamble on potentially bad players when they're free. And then the other thing is, I feel like John Ross, to this point, Corey Davis has had a lot of opportunities and he just hasn't taken advantage of them. Whereas John Ross, it kind of feels like he hasn't had that many opportunities. He's had, some bad injury luck. He's had, and some of it's his own fault. He hasn't been that great, but he's had some flashes of good play too. So I like somebody like John Ross more, just as I think he's somebody who's more likely to have his value unlocked on a second team. But if I had Corey Davis, I would be holding for sure at this point. And a little bit skeptical. I don't necessarily think he's going to sustain it, but if he does sustain it, good on him and good on you for holding, because I don't think there's necessarily any reason to doubt that this delayed breakout is not genuine for some reason.
So if he has a good year, devoid of any other talent on the team, you're willing to kind of accept that at face value as, no, he didn't have a good year because of X, Y, and Z. He had a good year because he had a good year. Now, whether or not that's going to continue, I don't know, but I'm willing to accept the fact that he had a good year. Is that kind of how you're seeing it?
Yeah, totally. There are some extreme circumstances. When Mike Martz went to Detroit, he really wanted a specific type of wide receiver, and there just wasn't anybody on the team who could fill that role. And so he converted one of his safeties, Mike Furry, to this slot wide receiver. And Mike Furry had like 90 or 100 catches and 900 yards and was like a totally viable fantasy wide receiver for a year, and then just completely fell off because after a year, Mike Martz went out and he got, a wide receiver who fit what he wanted to do. And I think there was reason to be skeptical of Mike Furry because, like, clearly this is something that was born of necessity. But there's this idea in fantasy football that you want to roster players on bad teams because somebody's got to catch the football. But, like, there are legitimately times, a couple years back, I tweeted, like, it was December and no Jets receiver had 400 receiving yards. So no, somebody doesn't have to catch the football. Like, none of the above is always a potential answer.
I think all you have to do is wait just till this December to see that happen again in the same circumstance.
If everybody's out on the Titans and Corey Davis is not good, Corey Davis is not going to produce. He's not going to, it's not like the ball's just going to magically teleport to his hands. He's still going to have to run routes. He's still going to have to get open. He's still going to have to catch the football. And if he can't do that, he's not going to produce no matter how bad everybody else around him is. Sometimes the answer is none of the above. So sure, if Corey Davis goes off for 1,000 yards this year, I'm going to believe that. I'm going to take that at face value for sure.
Are you going to sell that when the time comes? At the end of the year, would you be the type of person to go ahead and hold on to that asset and see what you really have and see if you can maybe take your 10,000 now, put it away, see if you can win the million, or are you taking the 10,000 and running?
See, here's always the answer. Depends on what somebody's offering.
Of course. All right, let's look at tight end. So final position here, Hunter Henry, David Njoku. Hunter Henry, I think, is going to be good. I think he's been shown to be decent. I think it really kind of is quarterback proof to a certain degree just because he is one of the best targets on that offense. And we just don't necessarily know how deep that offense is outside of Mike Williams, outside of Keenan Allen, outside of whatever they decide to do with Austin Eckler, scrambling quarterback. He doesn't necessarily target his running backs as a whole in Tyrod Taylor. But David Njoku, I think, is the more interesting asset here because I think David Njoku is also pretty much the same as O.J. Howard, who's also pretty much the same as another 5 guys in the league who were these highly valued tight ends as rookies, guys that somewhat flashed and kind of got people salivating about them, only to be kind of demoted further and further down the list of particular tight ends on their team and ending up in situations where they find themselves still producing, but producing in an uncertain role. I'm all about gobbling up value at tight end with guys that have uncertain roles, knowing that so often so many tight ends seem to kind of find their bright spot on that second team, like you mentioned some wide receivers did. Are you kind of the same way with that, or are you just maybe not sure about a guy that's had so many opportunities and never really had it work out fully for him? I know he's on the IR right now, but like I said, O.J. Howard is another example of that.
Yeah, so I ran historical comps and I wrote a piece on historical comps for O.J. Howard heading into last year. And when I wrote the piece, I wrote, all of these comps apply to a slightly lesser degree to Evan Engram, David Njoku, and Hunter Henry, because they all were drafted in a similar point in the draft, and draft capital is a big part of the comps to me. And they all had actually pretty similar production through 2 years. Hunter Henry's was 3 years, but he missed one of them to injury. And it didn't seem like they were very productive, but it's so rare for young tight ends to be productive that actually, if you adjust for era and you compare them to other first and second year tight ends and you account for their draft position, like the historical comps were not great. They were historically great. I mean, they were like O.J. Howard's historical comps heading into last year was basically like a who's who of every great fantasy tight end. I think it was like 7 of the top 10 fantasy tight ends of the last 30 years. Basically everybody except for Shannon Sharp, Tony Gonzalez, and I forget Wesley Walls, I think, was the other great tight end who they didn't comp to. And Gonzo just missed the cut. And so I was all in on O.J. Howard last year. And I liked Evan Engram and Hunter Henry for the same reasons. And I've never been as high on David Njoku, but from a objective standpoint, he was in that conversation too. And then obviously all of those guys disappointed for various reasons. I am still a believer in O.J. Howard long term. I kind of think that I'm not sure if we were wrong or if we were early. And early is not necessarily wrong. It's functionally the same as wrong sometimes. But I'm still holding Howard and seeing what happens. And if you were a believer in Njoku before, which, as I said, I wasn't so much, I think there's every reason to still maintain that glimmer of hope and hold on to him. Hunter Henry, same thing. I think all of those young tight ends, just they're comparable players through 2 years were just so good that I'm definitely not willing to give up on them just after one bad season.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm just trying to scoop up as many of those guys as possible, and I find a lot of my teams with Evan Ingram and with OJ Howard, and I think I might be upset right now, but in a couple of seasons, I think I might begin to see things in a different way because, yeah, it does take time for these guys to really kind of put it all together. And just the production that we've seen so far at a young age for a tight end is something that makes me think that there is still something here, even if it doesn't necessarily happen in this particular circumstance. So I think that Hunter Henry, David Njoku, I don't really think that you need to add anything there. If you want to go ahead and spend a 4th-round pick on the next decent rookie tight end, I think that's probably what you could do to backfill. But other than that, yeah, I do think that the person that's running this team has a very solid understanding of what they wanted to do with this team, how they wanted to build this team, how they wanted to purge this team of all assets that factually aren't going to be useful by the time the team is ready to compete. And that's one thing that I constantly kind of push in dynasty leagues. Like we talked about at the beginning of this whole thing, it doesn't pay to be 6th. It just doesn't. Sure, you make the playoffs maybe, but what happens then? So if you're going to shoot for the moon. And I think this is a team that might not necessarily get to the playoffs this year, but might get you a decent draft pick to add to a team that already has, from a bare bones perspective, something to work with here. If you go ahead and find 1 or 2 stars at a few positions, and if Jonathan Taylor turns out to be the star that I think consensus kind of thinks Jonathan Taylor is right now. So I want to go ahead and thank Vince Traveling on Twitter for this roster, for sending it in. Thank you so much for sending it in. If you want to be part of the show next week, all you got to do is leave us a rating and review. Go ahead and send us a picture of your roster along with that, and we will get your roster on the show. Adam, I want to turn it over to you. I wanted you to let the people know what you might have in the works going into the season, which you might be working on. I just want to kind of give you an opportunity to go ahead and plug whatever it is that you think the people should know about moving forward.
Yeah, so you find me on Twitter at Adam Harstad. I write at footballguys.com. Mostly I do, like kick returners, punt returners, kickers. I like picking areas where not a lot of people are doing it because then, there's not as much competition. So it's a lot easier to stand out. But yeah, Twitter and Football Guys.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, please go to our Patreon, to our store, nv.com, FF Pod Shirts store. It's run by Dynasty Outhouse. He has a bunch of merchandise on that store from a number of different podcasts that I'm sure you know. And 10%, I believe, goes to Fantasy Cares of every purchase. So we're also helping with the charity that launched the Scott Fish Bowl as well. Thank you for making it to the Dynasty Diagnostic Service Center today. Please be sure to keep up with all your scheduled maintenance and catch us next time to ensure quality performance. See you on your next visit.